Picture the year 1361. The once mighty Byzantine Empire, which had stood for nearly 1,000 years, is crumbling like a sandcastle against the tide. Its cities, once glittering with gold and grandeur, now echo with the sounds of desperation. Armies clash, borders shift, and the very fabric of power in Anatolia is unraveling. Into this chaos steps a small, seemingly insignificant Turkic principality, barely a speck on the map. No one at the time could have guessed that this humble beginning would ignite the rise of one of history's most formidable empires. But how did the Ottomans, a name now synonymous with conquest and grandeur, emerge from obscurity to dominate 3 continents? This isn't just a story of battles and borders. It's a tale of cunning strategy, unshakable ambition, and moments so pivotal they altered the course of history. Imagine a world where a single decision, a single victory or defeat could reshape empires. The Ottomans didn't just fill the power vacuum left by the Byzantines, they rewrote the rules of the game. From the ashes of a fading empire, they built something entirely new, a dynasty that would endure for 6 centuries. And it all started with a question: what does it take to turn a band of warriors into architects of destiny? You're about to step into a world where every alliance, every betrayal, and every stroke of luck played a part in an astonishing ascent. We'll uncover the secrets of the Ottoman rise, how they outmaneuvered rivals, harnessed innovation, and forged an empire that stretched from the gates of Vienna to the sands of Arabia. This is more than history, it's a masterclass in ambition, resilience, and the unpredictable tides of power. So settle in, because the story we're about to unravel is one you won't forget. The rise of the Ottomans wasn't just inevitable, it was extraordinary, and it all begins here. To understand how the Ottomans rose from obscurity, we need to rewind to the rugged hills of northwestern Anatolia in the late 13th century. Here, a Turkic tribal leader named Osman, later known as Osman I, forged a destiny far greater than anyone could have predicted. His people, the Osmanli, were just one of many small Turkic groups that had migrated into the region, fleeing the unstoppable force of the Mongol invasions. But where others saw chaos, Osman saw opportunity. Anatolia at this time was a fractured world. The Seljuk Sultanate, once the dominant power, was crumbling under Mongol pressure. The Byzantine Empire, though weakened, still clung to its western territories, its frontier a patchwork of crumbling fortresses and restless subjects. Into this power vacuum stepped warriors like Osman, men who knew the land, understood its politics, and had the audacity to dream bigger. What set Osman apart wasn't just ambition, it was strategy. Unlike the warlords who sought quick plunder, he played the long game. He struck alliances with local Christian lords when convenient, absorbed rival Turkic bands through diplomacy as often as warfare, and positioned himself as the defender of Muslim frontiers against Byzantine reprisals. The Mongol shadow kept larger powers distracted, and Osman used that breathing room to build something lasting. Legends swirl around his rise, visions of a great empire, dreams foretelling conquest, but the real story is one of shrewd opportunism. He didn't storm cities overnight, he chipped away at Byzantine defenses, securing small victories that added up. The key was his ability to inspire loyalty. Warriors flocked to his banner not just for loot, but because he offered something rare in that brutal age: a sense of purpose, a chance to build rather than just burn. This was far more than the birth of a dynasty, it was the birth of an idea. Osman wasn't just founding a state, he was laying the groundwork for an empire that would redefine the world. And it all started here, in the unstable foothills of a fading Byzantine frontier, where one man's vision turned a tribe into a force that would shape history. Legends say it began with a dream, one of those visions so vivid it blurs the line between prophecy and ambition. Osman, the young tribal leader, found himself in the home of a pious dervish one night where he was shown a sight that would alter history. A mighty tree sprouted from his chest, its roots digging deep into 3 continents, its branches stretching to shadow the earth. The moon and sun rested in its crown, and beneath its shade armies marched, cities rose, and dynasties flourished. When he awoke, the dervish interpreted the vision. This tree was his legacy, a sign that his descendants would rule an empire spanning Europe, Asia, and Africa. This story, later immortalized as Osman's dream, wasn't just folklore, it was political genius. In an era where power required divine justification, the Ottomans crafted a myth that framed their rise as destiny. Think of it like a medieval marketing campaign. By weaving this narrative into their origin story, they transformed Osman from a frontier warlord into a chosen instrument of fate. Rivals had swords, the Ottomans had symbolism, and symbols, as history shows, can be far more potent than steel. But there's a deeper layer here. The tree wasn't just about conquest, it was about order. Its roots represented stability, its branches justice. Ottoman rulers would later point to this vision to legitimize their rule, claiming they weren't just expanding territory but fulfilling a cosmic plan. Every sultan, from Mehmed the Conqueror to Suleiman the Magnificent, invoked this dream to justify wars, reforms, even the architecture of their mosques. When Mehmed stormed Constantinople in 1453, he didn't see himself as a mere conqueror, he was the inheritor of Osman's prophecy, the one destined to unite East and West. Yet myths like these are never just about the past, they're tools for the future. The dream became a rallying cry, a story whispered in army camps and scribbled in court chronicles. It gave ordinary soldiers a reason to fight beyond plunder. They were building something eternal, and for the empire's diverse subjects, from Balkan farmers to Arab scholars, it offered a shared identity under Ottoman rule. That's the power of a well-told legend. It turns bloodshed into saga, ambition into inevitability. Of course, skeptics might dismiss it as clever propaganda. After all, similar foundation myths exist across cultures, from Rome's she-wolf to the divine right of kings. But here's what sets Osman's dream apart. It wasn't just believed, it was lived. For 600 years, the Ottomans acted as if that tree were real, shaping policies, launching campaigns, and measuring their triumphs against its shadow. Whether the dream was divine inspiration or brilliant fiction hardly matters, because in the end it worked. The empire it birthed would dwarf even the grandest visions of that young Turkic chieftain sleeping in a dervish's hut, unaware he was dreaming the future into being. By 1326, Osman's vision was no longer just a dream. It had taken root in stone and mortar. The city of Bursa, nestled in the fertile foothills of Mount Uludag, became the first jewel in the Ottoman crown. Its fall wasn't a dramatic siege with flaming catapults or storming hordes. It was a slow squeeze. Osman's forces cut supply lines, isolated the city, and waited. When Bursa finally surrendered, it wasn't just a victory, it was a transformation. The Ottomans didn't raise the city, they made it their own. Bursa became more than a capital, it was a blueprint. Here, the Ottomans shifted from raiders to rulers. They adopted Byzantine administrative systems, minted coins bearing Osman's name, and turned the city's grand churches into mosques, signaling a new order. But the real masterstroke was what came next. Osman's son, Orhan, inherited not just a fledgling state but a strategy, expand through calculated patience. While other warlords chased glory in skirmishes, Orhan played chess on a continental scale. Then came the move that changed everything, the crossing into Europe. In 1354, an earthquake shattered the walls of Gallipoli on the strategic peninsula guarding the Dardanelles. The Ottomans didn't see disaster, they saw destiny. Seizing the ruined fortresses, they established a permanent bridgehead on European soil. This wasn't just a military advance, it was a psychological earthquake. For the first time, a Turkic power had a foothold in the Balkans, and there would be no retreat. Gallipoli gave the Ottomans control of the sea lanes between Asia and Europe, a choke point for trade and armies alike. But Orhan's genius lay in what he did next. Instead of pillaging the Balkans, he offered stability to a region fractured by feuding lords and weak Byzantine rule. Local rulers, weary of chaos, often submitted voluntarily, trading autonomy for Ottoman protection. The empire grew not just by the sword but by the shrewd promise of order, a tactic that would define Ottoman expansion for centuries. The capture of Bursa and the crossing into Europe were more than victories, they were declarations. The Ottomans weren't just another tribe vying for land. They were builders of an empire that blurred the lines between continents, cultures, and faiths. And it all began with a city in the shadow of a mountain and a shattered fortress by the sea. The Gazi spirit burned at the heart of the Ottoman rise, an intoxicating mix of faith, ferocity, and frontier ambition. These warrior saints, as they were called, saw themselves as the sword arm of Islam, carving out new domains for the faithful. But here's the twist: the Ottomans wielded religious fervor with one hand and cold pragmatism with the other. Their genius wasn't just in uniting tribes under the banner of jihad. It was in knowing exactly when to lower that banner and cut a deal. Picture the Ghazi bands roaming Anatolia's borderlands. To them, every skirmish against Byzantine outposts was more than a raid. It was a sacred duty. They fought not just for land but for eternal reward, their victories framed as steps toward Islam's expansion. Poets sang of their exploits, comparing them to the earliest companions of the Prophet. This wasn't mere propaganda, it was identity. The Ottomans didn't just recruit soldiers, they cultivated a culture where martyrdom in battle was the highest honor, where dying for the faith meant a guaranteed place in paradise. Yet for all this holy rhetoric, the Ottomans were masters of realpolitik. While Ghazis raided Christian villages, Ottoman rulers quietly formed alliances with Byzantine lords and even married into Christian noble families. Take Orhan's marriage to Theodora, daughter of a Byzantine emperor, hardly the act of a fanatical holy warrior. These alliances weren't contradictions, they were calculations. The Ottomans understood that to build an empire, you needed both the zeal of believers and the signatures of diplomats. Consider how they handled conquered territories. Unlike the Mongols, who often left smoking ruins, the Ottomans offered a choice: submit and keep your faith, or resist and face the sword. Many Balkan Christians chose the former, becoming loyal subjects under a system that taxed them but didn't force conversion. This wasn't tolerance for its own sake, it was policy. Empty lands couldn't pay taxes and rebellious populations drained armies. Better to let churches stand and collect gold than to burn them and gain nothing but ashes. The Ghazi ethos gave the Ottomans something priceless: momentum. It turned hungry frontier fighters into a cohesive force united by a higher purpose. But what truly set them apart was their willingness to set that purpose aside when the situation demanded. They could quote the Quran one day and negotiate with Venetian merchants the next. This duality, holy war when convenient, shrewd diplomacy when necessary, became the signature of Ottoman expansion. So were they holy warriors or pragmatic empire builders? The answer is both. The Ghazi ideal provided the fuel, but it was the Ottomans' flexibility that steered the engine. They built an empire not despite their contradictions but because of them, proving that the most enduring powers are those that can wield both the sword and the ledger. Imagine a system so effective yet so ruthless that it could pluck a shepherd boy from the hills of Bosnia and transform him into the Grand Vizier of an empire. This was the devshirme, the Ottoman Empire's most ingenious and chilling method of power consolidation. Every few years, officials would fan out across Christian villages in the Balkans, selecting one in every 5 boys between the ages of 8 and 20. These children, taken from their families, would never return home. Instead, they'd be raised as Muslims, drilled in combat or administration, and molded into the empire's most trusted servants. To modern eyes, it sounds like cultural erasure. To the Ottomans, it was the ultimate meritocracy. The brilliance of the devshirme lay in its cold logic. By recruiting from conquered Christian populations, the sultans created a ruling class with no local loyalties. These boys owed everything to the state: their education, their status, even their new identities. Unlike Ottoman nobles who might prioritize family over empire, devshirme graduates had no dynasty to rival the sultans. Their allegiance was absolute. And the training relentless. The brightest were groomed for civil service, studying Persian, Arabic, and the intricacies of statecraft. The strongest joined the Janissaries, the elite infantry feared across Europe. But here's the paradox: while the system was coercive, it also offered unparalleled mobility. For Christian families in impoverished regions, the devshirme could be a grim opportunity. A son taken might rise to wield more power than his ancestors ever dreamed. Some families even bribed officials to select their boys, gambling on the empire's promise of advancement. The most famous example, Suleiman Pasha, a Serb by birth, who became the empire's de facto ruler under 3 sultans, directing armies and diplomacy from the pinnacle of Ottoman power. Critics called it a blood tax. Defenders saw it as social engineering at its most effective. The truth lies somewhere in between. The devshirme didn't just supply soldiers and bureaucrats, it manufactured loyalty on an industrial scale. And in an empire spanning 3 continents where rebellions simmered and rivals loomed, that loyalty was the ultimate currency. The system's cruelty was undeniable, but so was its results. For centuries, it produced the administrators who governed provinces, the generals who expanded borders, and the advisors who whispered policy into sultans' ears. What's often overlooked is how the devshirme shaped Ottoman culture itself. These recruits brought their native languages, customs, and perspectives into the empire's heart, creating a ruling elite as diverse as the territories they controlled. The system wasn't just about control, it was a forced melting pot, blending Balkan resilience, Anatolian discipline, and Islamic scholarship into something entirely new. By the time the devshirme was abolished in the 17th century, it had left an indelible mark. The Ottomans didn't just build an empire, they engineered its architects, one levied child at a time. The summer of 1389 scorched the plains of Kosovo, a battlefield that would become legend. On one side stood Sultan Murad I, the Ottoman ruler who had transformed his father's frontier principality into a rising empire. Facing him was Prince Lazar of Serbia, a leader binding together a fragile coalition of Balkan kings and warlords. What happened next wasn't just a clash of armies. It became the stuff of myth, martyrdom, and competing national epics that still echo today. As dawn broke on June 28th, the 2 forces collided in a storm of swords and arrows. The Ottomans, though outnumbered, held the advantage of disciplined Janissaries and cunning tactics. Yet the battle was far from one-sided. Serbian knights, heavily armored and desperate to halt the Ottoman advance, carved through Murad's lines in furious charges. The fighting dragged on for hours, the field littered with the dead. Then came the moment that would immortalize the day. A Serbian nobleman named Miloš Obilić, feigning surrender, was brought before the Sultan. In a flash, he drew a concealed dagger and plunged it into Murad's heart. The Ottoman ruler died on the spot, the first and only sultan ever assassinated in battle. But here's where history twists into legend. Serbian folklore paints Kosovo as a catastrophic defeat, a sacrifice where Lazar and his knights chose heavenly glory over earthly victory. Ottoman chronicles, meanwhile, claim their forces triumphed despite Murad's death, with his son Bayezid swiftly taking command to rout the Serbs. The truth: it was likely a bloody stalemate. Both armies withdrew, decimated. The Ottomans, with their deeper reserves and centralized leadership, could recover faster. Serbia, fractured and exhausted, would gradually fall under Ottoman dominance. Yet Kosovo's real legacy isn't in who held the field that day, it's in the stories born from it. For Serbians, the battle became a sacred symbol of resistance, a rallying cry during centuries of Ottoman rule. Lazar's purported choice between a heavenly kingdom and an earthly one was recast as a moral cornerstone of Serbian identity. For the Ottomans, Murad's martyrdom justified future campaigns, framing their expansion as divine retribution. Even Obilik's dagger stroke took on mythic weight, celebrated in epic poems as the ultimate act of defiance. Centuries later, Kosovo's shadows linger. The battlefield is still a pilgrimage site, its myths invoked in wars and nationalist movements. But peel back the layers of legend, and you'll find a more nuanced truth. This wasn't just a fight for land, but for narrative control. Both sides needed Kosovo to mean something greater than a messy, inconclusive slaughter, and in that they succeeded beyond imagining. The battle's true victory wasn't won with swords, it was won in the stories told afterward, stories that still shape how empires and nations remember themselves. Bayezid I earned his nickname, the Thunderbolt, for a reason: his conquest struck with terrifying speed. Within a decade of inheriting the throne in 1389, he had doubled the size of the Ottoman realm, swallowing up rival Turkish beyliks and Balkan kingdoms with relentless efficiency. But one prize still eluded him: Constantinople, the legendary heart of the Byzantine Empire. By 1394, Bayezid's armies had encircled the city, cutting off its land routes and strangling its supply lines. The siege dragged on for years, a slow squeeze meant to break the Byzantines through starvation rather than storm. Inside the walls, Emperor Manuel II grew desperate, sending appeals to Europe for a crusade that never came. The Ottomans, it seemed, were on the verge of ending an empire that had stood for over 1,000 years. Then came the Thunderbolt's reckoning. From the east emerged a threat even Bayezid couldn't outmaneuver: Timur, the infamous conqueror known to history as Tamerlane. This wasn't just another rival. Timur was a whirlwind of destruction, a man who built pyramids of skulls and claimed descent from Genghis Khan. When Bayezid refused to submit, Timur marched westward, his army a monstrous blend of Mongol cavalry and Persian siege engines. The two forces collided near Ankara in July 1402, in a battle that would shatter Ottoman ambitions. The heat that day was unbearable, the battlefield a dust-choked hell. Bayezid, confident in his Janissaries and Balkan vassals, made a fatal error: he underestimated Timur's tactics. The wily conqueror had bribed key Ottoman allies, including the Turkic horsemen whose defection left Bayezid's flank exposed. By afternoon, the Thunderbolt's forces were routed. Bayezid himself was captured, paraded in a cage like a trophy before dying in captivity less than a year later. The empire he'd built so swiftly fractured almost overnight, his sons plunging into a decade of civil war. Yet the Battle of Ankara's true significance wasn't just in its carnage, it was in the lesson it seared into Ottoman memory. Timur didn't just defeat Bayezid, he exposed the fragility of an empire built too quickly, too ruthlessly. The near collapse that followed became a cautionary tale for future sultans, a reminder that even the mightiest could fall if they overreached. And for Constantinople, it was a reprieve. The Byzantines, clinging to their crumbling walls, would survive another 50 years. But the Thunderbolt siege had shown the world the Ottomans weren't just a passing storm. They were the coming tempest, and no city, no matter how ancient, could hold them back forever. The aftermath of Ankara was chaos incarnate. Bayezid the Thunderbolt's empire, once stretching from the Danube to the Euphrates, splintered into warring fragments as his four sons turned on each other in a bloody scramble for power. For 11 grueling years, the Ottomans weren't conquerors. They were survivors, locked in a fratricidal free-for-all that historians would later call the interregnum. This wasn't just a power vacuum, it was a crucible forging the brutal policies that would define Ottoman succession for centuries. At the center of the storm stood Mehmed, the youngest of Bayezid's sons. Unlike his brothers, who relied on brute force and hastily assembled alliances, Mehmed played the long game. he let his siblings exhaust themselves in battles across Anatolia and the Balkans, biding his time in the rugged highlands of Rumelia. While Isa and Suleiman clashed over Bursa and Musa tangled with Byzantine proxies, Mehmed quietly consolidated power, winning over frontier Ghazis and Janissary commanders with promises of stability. By the time he struck, his rivals were already shadows of their former selves. The turning point came in 1413 at the Battle of Samarlu, where Mehmed faced his last surviving brother, Musa. The clash was less a grand confrontation than a grim inevitability. Musa's forces, strained by years of campaigning and desertions, crumbled under Mehmed's disciplined troops. With Musa's death, the interregnum ended, but its lessons were etched in blood. Mehmed, now Mehmed I, had won by outlasting his brothers, not just outfighting them. The message was clear: in the Ottoman world, survival trumped valor. This decade of carnage birthed one of history's most ruthless succession laws, the infamous law of fratricide. Future sultans, starting with Mehmed's grandson Mehmed the Conqueror, would formalize what the interregnum had implied, that the state's stability justified any means. Upon a sultan's death, his sons were expected to fight, and the victor would execute his brothers to prevent civil war. Harsh, undoubtedly effective. Devastatingly so, the policy turned succession into a winner-takes-all deathmatch, but it also ensured the empire wouldn't fracture again as it had after Ankara. Yet there's a tragic irony here. The interregnum's violence was born from Timur's revelation that rapid expansion without consolidation was fatal. Mehmed's victory didn't just restore the empire, it redefined its DNA. From then on, Ottomans prized continuity over conquest, calculating that a single strong ruler, however ruthless, was better than fragmented chaos. The Ghazi spirit that once drove expansion now served a centralized machine. The interregnum wasn't just a crisis, it was the painful rebirth of an empire learning to govern as fiercely as it could fight. At just 12 years old, Mehmed II inherited a fractured empire still reeling from his father's defeat by Timur. Thrust onto the throne in 1444, this bookish, introverted prince seemed an unlikely savior. The court whispered, could a boy more comfortable with Greek philosophers than swordplay possibly restore Ottoman glory? But beneath that quiet exterior burned an ambition forged in history's grandest dreams. Mehmed didn't just want to rule, he wanted to eclipse legends. His idol, Alexander the Great, the son of a Macedonian king who'd conquered the known world before 30, Mehmed's tutors stoked this obsession, filling his head with tales of ancient empires while he pored over maps of Constantinople, that unconquered jewel straddling 2 continents. By 19, after a brief interruption when his father retook the throne, Mehmed returned to power with a singular fixation, the city Byzantines called the Queen of Cities. But this wouldn't be another haphazard siege. The young sultan approached the challenge like a scholar solving an equation. He studied every failed attempt from the Arab sieges of the 7th century to his own great-grandfather Bayezid's blockade. The lessons were clear. Constantinople's triple walls and strategic position made frontal assaults futile. Victory required innovation on an unprecedented scale. Mehmed's preparations were nothing short of revolutionary. He lured the Hungarian cannon founder Urban to his court, commissioning a weapon so massive it took 60 oxen to transport its 27-foot barrel. This monster, the basilica, could hurl 600-pound stones over a mile, enough to crack the Theodosian walls that had stood impregnable for 1,000 years. But cannons alone wouldn't suffice. The young sultan orchestrated a masterstroke of logistics, building the fortress of Rumeli Hisari on the Bosporus to strangle Byzantine supply lines. When Venetian ships tried to run the blockade, Ottoman artillery sank them in full view of the city's terrified defenders. Yet Mehmed understood that walls weren't Constantinople's only defense, its mystique was equally formidable. To shatter that aura, he weaponized psychology. He welcomed Byzantine envoys with calculated cruelty. casually sharpening his sword during negotiations while boasting of the atrocities his troops would commit. At night, he devoured texts on siegecraft and Roman military tactics, annotating them in the margins with strategies to counter each of Constantinople's strengths. His most audacious plan, to bypass the city's colossal chain blocking the Golden Horn by hauling 70 ships overland on greased logs, appearing one morning behind Byzantine lines as if by sorcery. This wasn't just military genius, it was theater. Every move was designed to erode hope, to make resistance feel futile. By the time the final assault came in May 1453, Mehmed had transformed from a bookish boy into a predator circling his prey. He'd calculated every variable: the angle of cannon fire needed to collapse the walls, the tidal patterns affecting naval support, even the superstitions of Byzantine defenders who saw eclipses as omens of doom. When his Janissaries finally breached the gates after 53 brutal days, it wasn't luck that broke an empire. It was the relentless will of a teenager who'd spent his life preparing for this single moment. The world would soon know him by a new title, Mehmed the Conqueror, but in those final hours before the walls fell, Mehmed was simply a young man standing in the shadow of history, about to step into legend. The Ottomans didn't just surround Constantinople in 1453, they rewrote the rules of siege warfare. At the heart of their strategy stood a Hungarian defector named Urban, whose cannons would become the sledgehammer to crack a millennium of Byzantine defiance. A master of metallurgy, Urban had initially offered his services to Emperor Constantine XI, but the cash-strapped Byzantines couldn't match Mehmed's blank check ambition. With Ottoman gold funding his experiments, Urban forged the Basilica, a bronze monstrosity so massive it took 3 hours to cool between shots. Measuring 27 feet long and weighing 18 tons, it hurled stone balls the size of wine barrels, each impact shaking Constantinople's walls like earthquake tremors. But brute force alone couldn't topple the Theodosian walls, a triple-layered labyrinth of stone and mortar that had repulsed 23 sieges over 11 centuries. Mehmed's genius lay in combining Urban's firepower with precision targeting. Ottoman engineers plotted trajectories like mathematicians, concentrating fire on single sections until outer walls crumbled, then methodically pounding the same spots for weeks to expose the inner fortifications. The basilica's recoil was so violent it required rebuilding its stone emplacement after every volley. Yet Mehmed's crews worked around the clock, their relentless barrage turning portions of the land walls into rubble piles. Meanwhile, the Sultan orchestrated a maritime stranglehold unseen in medieval warfare. Byzantine morale hinged on supply ships slipping through the Ottoman blockade, so Mehmed transformed the Bosporus into a kill zone. His fleet of over 100 vessels, a mix of war galleys and repurposed merchant ships, patrolled day and night. But the real masterstroke came when Venetian relief ships broke through in April. Ottoman cannon fire sank one, captured another, and sent the rest fleeing. Mehmed then ordered the unthinkable. A fleet transported overland. Under cover of darkness, crews greased logs and dragged 70 ships across Galota's hills, bypassing the giant chain blocking the Golden Horn. When dawn broke, Byzantine sentries gaped at Ottoman sails where no waterway existed, a psychological blow as devastating as any cannonade. The siege also showcased psychological warfare at its most calculated. Mehmed staged nighttime bonfires and deafening drum circles to deny defenders sleep, while his archers launched disease-riddled corpses over the walls. Yet for all his technological dominance, the young Sultan knew final victory required human sacrifice. On May 29th, he unleashed his elite Janissaries in waves, their attack timed to exploit a poorly repaired breach near the St. Romanus Gate. As dawn's first light revealed the Ottoman banners fluttering over the shattered walls, the world grasped the magnitude of Mehmed's achievement. He hadn't just conquered a city, he'd rendered medieval fortifications obsolete, proving that innovation, when married to ruthless determination, could topple even the mightiest symbols of empire. Dawn on May 29, 1453, broke over Constantinople with an eerie stillness, the calm before the storm. Inside the city's battered walls, Emperor Constantine XI moved among his exhausted defenders, a sword strapped to his side and resignation in his eyes. For 7 weeks, they'd withstood the Ottoman onslaught, but now the end was near. The massive basilica cannon had reduced entire sections of the Theodosian walls to rubble. Ottoman engineers had filled the moats with dirt and wooden palisades, and Mehmed, just 21 years old, had massed his elite Janissaries at the weakest breach near the ascent. Romanesque gate, their polished armor glinting in the pre-dawn light, Constantine knew what was coming. The night before, he'd presided over a final, somber ceremony in Hagia Sophia, where Orthodox priests and Catholic mercenaries, divisions forgotten in this desperate hour, received communion together. Now, as Ottoman war drums throbbed and the cries of Allahu Akbar echoed across the battlefield, the last Byzantine emperor made his choice. He discarded his imperial purple cloak, ensuring no one could identify his body, and led his men into the fray. What followed wasn't just a battle, it was the death rattle of an empire. The Janissaries attacked in relentless waves, climbing over the bodies of their fallen comrades as Byzantine defenders, outnumbered 10-1, fought with spears, axes, even their bare hands. At one critical moment, a small band of Genos mercenaries guarding a vital tower panicked and fled, leaving a gap in the defenses. Ottoman troops poured through like floodwater. Constantine, sword in hand, plunged into the melee near the breached gate and vanished. Some say he fell anonymously in the chaos, his body lost beneath the trampling feet. Others claim he was beheaded, his skull later gilded and displayed as a trophy. Whatever the truth, his defiance turned him into legend, the emperor who chose to die with his city rather than flee. By midday, the double-headed eagle banners of Byzantium lay trampled in the streets. Mehmed entered Constantinople not as a destroyer but as a conqueror claiming his destiny. His first stop was Hagia Sophia, where he marveled at the soaring dome, an architectural marvel his ancestors could only dream of. In a gesture both symbolic and pragmatic, he converted the great church into a mosque, yet shockingly spared its Christian mosaics. This wasn't mindless destruction, it was the calculated rebranding of a global capital. He even allowed the Greek Orthodox Church to endure, so long as it acknowledged Ottoman rule, a policy of controlled tolerance that would define his empire. The fall of Constantinople didn't just topple a city, it shattered an era. For Europe, it was a psychic earthquake. The last remnant of Rome, that grand thread connecting antiquity to the present, was gone. Scholars fleeing westward carried precious manuscripts, accelerating the Renaissance. Trade routes shifted overnight, plunging Venice and Genoa into decline while empowering Ottoman-controlled markets. Some historians mark 1453 as the official end of the Middle Ages, not with a whimper, but with the thunder of cannons and the clatter of Janissary boots on ancient cobblestones. Yet Mehmed saw none of this as an ending. To him, Constantinople, now Istanbul, was just the beginning. He styled himself Caesar I Rum, Caesar of Rome, claiming the mantle of the very empire he destroyed. The city's libraries became his classrooms, its ruined palaces his blueprints. Within years, he'd repopulated the capital with Greeks, Armenians, Turks, and Jews, crafting a cosmopolitan hub where East and West intertwined. The Ottoman Empire wasn't just inheriting Byzantium's land, it was absorbing its legacy, proving that even in conquest nothing truly dies, it merely changes hands. And so, on that blood-soaked May morning, as the last Byzantine emperor's body cooled in the rubble, a new world order took its first triumphant breath. Mehmed the Conqueror didn't just take Constantinople, he reinvented it. The city he captured in 1453 was a shadow of its former glory. Its population dwindled to mere tens of thousands, its grand avenues lined with crumbling ruins. But where others saw decay, Mehmed envisioned a masterpiece. His first act was startlingly pragmatic. He declared an open invitation. artisans, merchants, and scholars from across the empire, Muslims, Christians, and Jews alike, were promised tax exemptions and property rights if they settled in the new capital. Within months, neighborhoods once empty buzzed with the languages of Anatolia, the Balkans, and beyond. This wasn't just repopulation, it was alchemy, transforming a defeated city into a living crossroads of cultures. At the heart of this rebirth stood the Grand Bazaar, a sprawling labyrinth of commerce that became the empire's economic pulse. Mehmed didn't just build markets, he engineered destiny. By relocating entire guilds from conquered cities like Bursa and Edirne, he ensured the bazaar stalls overflowed with Persian silks, Venetian glass, and spices from as far as India. The genius lay in the details: covered streets to shield merchants from rain, a strict code of fair pricing enforced by Ottoman judges, and even a dedicated police force to thwart thieves. The result, a trading hub so vibrant it dwarfed anything in Europe, a place where fortunes were made before noon and the empire's multicultural identity was bartered along with goods. Then there was Topkapi Palace, the ultimate symbol of Ottoman might and sophistication. Perched on the city's highest hill overlooking two continents, it wasn't just a royal residence, it was a carefully choreographed theater of power. 4 successive courtyards marked a visitor's journey from the outer world to the Sultan's innermost sanctum, each gate a threshold of increasing exclusivity. The palace kitchens alone fed thousands daily, their recipes blending Central Asian lamb dishes with Mediterranean olive oil and Balkan cheeses. But Mehmed's boldest statement lay in the palace's very design. Byzantine mosaics were preserved alongside intricate Islamic calligraphy, a visual manifesto that the Ottomans were inheritors of all who came before. What truly set Mehmed apart, though, was his approach to faith. While most conquerors would impose their religion by force, he wielded tolerance as a tool of statecraft. The Greek Orthodox Patriarchate was reinstated within months of the conquest. Its clergy granted autonomy to govern their flock so long as they swore loyalty to the Sultan. Armenian churches and Jewish synagogues flourished under similar agreements. This wasn't altruism, it was strategy. By allowing each millet or religious community to administer its own laws and schools, Mehmed turned potential rebels into stakeholders. Tax revenues soared, rebellions dwindled, and Istanbul became a magnet for Europe's persecuted, from Sephardic Jews expelled by Spain to Protestant heretics fleeing Catholic persecution. The city's skyline told the story of this synthesis. Hagia Sophia's crosses were replaced by minarets, yet its Christian mosaics remained untouched, a silent testament to layered histories. New mosques borrowed Byzantine domes but added Ottoman pencil-thin minarets, creating an architectural dialect that spoke to both past and future. Even the city's name evolved organically. Locals still called it Constantinople for generations, while the Ottomans used Konstantinii alongside the informal Istanbul, derived from the Greek phrase "Eis tin pollen," meaning "to the city." Mehmed's vision transformed more than stone and mortar. He turned a war prize into a living argument that empires endure not by erasing what came before, but by absorbing it. By the time of his death in 1481, Istanbul wasn't just the Ottoman capital. It was the beating heart of a world empire, a place where an Armenian goldsmith could haggle with a Turkish soldier over a Georgian-made dagger, while an Italian diplomat took notes nearby. The conqueror's true legacy wasn't just in the walls he toppled, but in the bridges he built. By 1514, the Ottoman Empire had grown into a regional powerhouse, but one man would make it a global contender. Selim I, a ruler whose very name struck fear into his enemies. History remembers him as Yavuz, the Grim, a fitting title for a sultan who reshaped the empire through sheer, unrelenting force. His reign marked a pivotal shift, turning the Ottomans from a dominant regional player into the undisputed masters of the Islamic world. And it all began with fire and steel on the plains of Chaldiran. The Safavid Empire, led by Shah Ismail, posed a threat unlike any the Ottomans had faced. This wasn't just a rival state, it was an ideological wildfire. Ismail's fervent Shia ideology spread like a contagion, winning over Turkic tribes along the Ottoman border and challenging Sunni supremacy. Selim couldn't ignore it, not just because of territory, but because the Safavids threatened the very legitimacy of Ottoman rule. So he did what he did best: he marched. The Battle of Chaldiran in August 1514 was a brutal lesson in military evolution. Selim's forces, though outnumbered, wielded something the Safavids lacked: gunpowder. The Safavid cavalry, elite warriors known as the Kizilbash, charged with fanatical bravery, their curved swords gleaming. But against the disciplined ranks of Ottoman Janissaries and their wall of cannons, courage wasn't enough. The Safavids shattered like glass against stone. Selim's artillery didn't just win the battle, it announced a new era, one where firepower trumped fanaticism. Yet Selim wasn't satisfied with victory alone. He pursued Ismail's shattered army deep into Persia, determined to annihilate the Safavid threat once and for all. Tabriz, the Safavid capital, fell swiftly, its treasures looted, its libraries burned. But here's the irony: Selim's brutality backfired. His scorched earth tactics turned Persian sentiment against him, hardening resistance rather than crushing it. The Safavids survived, but their dream of expansion westward died at Chaldiran, securing Ottoman dominance in Anatolia for centuries. No sooner had Selim crushed the Safavids than he turned his gaze south, to the Mamluks of Egypt, the aging guardians of the Islamic heartland. The Mamluks were legendary warriors, a slave soldier caste who had ruled Egypt for centuries. But their glory days were long past. When Selim's armies clashed with theirs in 1517 at the battles of Marj Dabik and Ridania, the outcome was never in doubt. The Mamluks fought with medieval tactics, relying on heavy cavalry charges and personal valor. The Ottomans, they fought like a machine. At Ridania, Selim pulled off a maneuver so daring it stunned his enemies. Instead of attacking the Mamluk trenches head-on, he led his army on a grueling desert march, flanking the entrenched positions and striking from behind. The Mamluks, caught between cannon fire and disciplined Janissary ranks, collapsed. Cairo fell soon after, its streets running with blood as the last Mamluk sultan, Tuman Bey, was hanged from the city gates. But Selim's conquests weren't just about land. With the fall of the Mamluks, he seized something far more valuable: the title of Caliph, the spiritual leader of Sunni Islam. The Abbasid Caliph, a figurehead under Mamluk protection, was quietly ushered to Istanbul, where he transferred the caliphate to Selim. Whether the transfer was coerced or ceremonial hardly mattered. The Ottomans now held Mecca and Medina, the holiest cities of Islam, and with them unrivaled religious authority. Selim's reign was short, just 8 years, but in that time he doubled the size of the empire. His legacy wasn't just territory, it was a blueprint for Ottoman supremacy. He proved that ideology could be as potent a weapon as cannon fire, and that sometimes to secure an empire's future, a ruler had to be willing to be feared. By the time of his death in 1520, the Ottoman Empire wasn't just a regional power. It was the undisputed heavyweight of the Islamic world, poised to challenge even Europe's mightiest kingdoms. And it was all because of a sultan who ruled not with a golden scepter, but with an iron fist. By 1520, the Ottoman Empire was already a colossus, but under Suleiman I, it would become something more: a civilization. Crowned Sultan at 26, he inherited an empire stretched across 3 continents, yet his reign wasn't about mere expansion. It was about refinement, about transforming raw power into enduring legacy. Europe would call him the Magnificent, but to his subjects he was Kanuni, the lawgiver, and in that title lay the secret to his greatness. Suleiman's first act was to overhaul an empire groaning under its own weight. His legal reforms weren't just tweaks, they were a revolution in ink. For centuries, Ottoman rulers had governed through a patchwork of tribal customs, Islamic law, and arbitrary decrees. Suleiman codified everything. His canon names, legal statutes, standardized taxation, criminal justice, even land rights from the Danube to the Euphrates. Imagine it, a peasant in Bosnia and a merchant in Damascus bound by the same fair rules, their disputes settled not by a local warlord's whim, but by a scribe referencing Suleiman's meticulously organized ledgers. This was bureaucracy as an art form, turning chaos into order with the stroke of a pen. Yet laws alone don't build legends. Suleiman knew power needed poetry, and his court became a beacon for the creative minds of the age. The Sultan himself, a gifted poet writing under the pen name Muhibbi, filled palaces with verse comparing his beloved harem sultan to the moon eclipsing all other stars. His chief architect, Sinan, didn't just construct buildings, he engineered marvels. The Suleimani Mosque, rising over Istanbul's skyline, was more than a place of worship. Its acoustics were calibrated so a whisper at the pulpit could reach every corner. Its domes, cascading like suspended waterfalls of stone, defied gravity and rivaled Hagia Sophia. And beneath its courtyards lay a hospital, a soup kitchen, even a library, a monument to the Ottoman ideal that beauty and utility were inseparable. Then there were the conquests. While Suleiman's father, Selim the Grim, had expanded the empire through brute force, Suleiman wielded strategy like a scalpel. His campaign against Hungary in 1526 wasn't just a military operation, it was geopolitical theater. At the Battle of Mohács, Ottoman cannons reduced the Hungarian knights to a forest of severed limbs, as one chronicler grimly noted, but the real masterstroke came afterward. Rather than annexing Hungary outright, Suleiman installed a puppet king, turning the kingdom into a buffer zone against Habsburg ambitions. It was chess on a continental scale, each move calculated to keep rivals off balance. Even his failures became legend. The Siege of Vienna in 1529, though ultimately unsuccessful, sent shockwaves through Europe. For the first time, Ottoman tents stood within sight of the Habsburg capital, a psychological victory that haunted European rulers for generations. And his naval campaigns under the pirate king-turned-admiral Hayreddin Barbarossa turned the Mediterranean into an Ottoman lake, with fleets menacing Spain's coast and rescuing persecuted Muslims from the Inquisition's grip. But perhaps Suleiman's most radical act was redefining what it meant to rule. While European monarchs clung to divine right, he presented himself as the shadow of God on earth, not a distant tyrant, but a shepherd responsible for his flock's welfare. His marriage to Hurrem, a former slave girl, scandalized courts worldwide, but it also signaled that merit could trump birthright in the Ottoman world. When he died in 1566, after 46 years on the throne, the empire didn't just lose a sultan. It lost its golden age incarnate. The frontiers he'd secured, the laws he'd penned, the skyline he'd transformed, all stood as testament to a simple truth, that the highest form of power isn't domination but legacy. And few in history have left one so luminous. The island of Rhodes had been a thorn in the Ottoman side for decades. Perched just off Anatolia's coast, this fortress island was the last stronghold of the Knights Hospitaller, a fanatical Christian order that had plagued Muslim shipping for centuries. By 1522, Suleiman the Magnificent had had enough. Fresh off his triumph at Belgrade, he turned his gaze toward the Mediterranean, determined to erase this relic of the Crusades once and for all. What followed wasn't just a siege, it was a brutal showcase of Ottoman engineering and naval might, a 6-month spectacle of fire, stone, and sheer willpower. The Knights Hospitaller were no ordinary opponents. These battle-hardened warriors, survivors of the Crusades' final collapse, had spent 2 centuries transforming Rhodes into an impregnable maze of bastions, moats, and underground tunnels. Their fortifications were a masterpiece of medieval military architecture, designed to withstand years of assault. But Suleiman came prepared. His army, over 100,000 strong, included not just Janissaries but sappers from across the empire, miners from Serbia, and cannon crews trained on the latest European artillery techniques. The Sultan's fleet, freshly expanded with sleek new galleys, sealed off the island, cutting roads from any hope of reinforcement. The siege became a grinding war of attrition. Ottoman cannons pounded the walls day and night, their thunder echoing across the Aegean. Sappers dug tunnels beneath the fortifications, only to be met with counter-tunnels where the knights detonated gunpowder traps. At one point, a tower collapsed from Turkish mining, burying dozens of Janissaries in rubble, but the knights paid dearly for every inch. Their Grand Master, Philippe Villiers de l'Isle-Adam, led aged knights and mercenaries in desperate sorties, buying time with blood. Disease ravaged both camps, and by autumn, Rhodes' cisterns ran dry, forcing defenders to drink wine mixed with seawater. Victory, when it came, was bittersweet. Suleiman, impressed by the knights' valor, offered astonishingly generous terms: safe passage for survivors, 3 years' grace for Rhodian citizens who wished to leave, even permission for the knights to take their sacred relics. It was a rare moment of chivalry in an age of total war, a nod to the shared respect between worthy foes. But the real prize was strategic. With Rhodes in Ottoman hands, the eastern Mediterranean became an Ottoman lake, its shipping lanes secured, its islands gradually falling under the Sultan's sway. Yet the siege also exposed cracks in Ottoman naval dominance. The knights, though defeated, escaped to Malta, a mistake Suleiman would come to regret. 43 years later, in 1565, his son Selim II sent an even larger force to crush them once and for all, but Malta was different. The knights had learned from Rhodes, building deeper fortifications and stockpiling supplies. Worse, the Ottomans had grown overconfident. Their fleet, though vast, lacked the coordination of Suleiman's era. Dysfunctional command squabbles and relentless Maltese resistance turned the siege into a fiasco. By September, with Spanish reinforcements arriving and Ottoman morale collapsing, the invaders slunk away in disgrace. These twin sieges, Rhodes and Malta, bookended the zenith of Ottoman sea power. One demonstrated their ability to adapt, to master new forms of warfare. The other revealed the limits of imperial overreach. The lesson was clear: even the mightiest empires falter when they mistake momentum for inevitability. Rhodes had been a hard-won triumph, Malta a humbling reminder that no dominion lasts forever. And in that tension between ambition and reality, the Ottomans faced their most enduring challenge, not just conquering the world but holding it. The summer of 1526 found Hungary's plains baking under an unrelenting sun, a fitting stage for one of history's most lopsided battles. King Louis II of Hungary, barely 20 years old and burdened by a fractious nobility, faced an existential threat. Suleiman the Magnificent's Ottoman army, over 100,000 strong, was marching north with terrifying purpose. The Hungarians, clinging to medieval notions of knightly valor, assembled their forces near Mohács, a small town on the Danube's west bank. What happened next wasn't just a defeat, it was a masterclass in the collision between old-world chivalry and Ottoman military innovation. Louis' army, though outnumbered, boasted some of Europe's finest heavy cavalry knights in gleaming plate armor, trained to charge with lance and sword. But against Suleiman's disciplined Janissaries and his artillery corps, they might as well have been charging into a meat grinder. The Ottomans didn't just outgun the Hungarians, they outthought them. As the knights advanced across the marshy terrain, Ottoman cannons carved bloody gaps in their ranks. Then, just as the survivors closed in, Suleiman's Sipahi cavalry struck from the flanks, their curved sabers cutting through disordered formations. The battle lasted barely 2 hours. By dusk, nearly 20,000 Hungarians lay dead, including Louis himself, whose drowned body was found days later in a swamp, weighed down by his armor. Mohács wasn't merely a military disaster, it was a geopolitical earthquake. With Hungary's army annihilated and its king dead, the kingdom fractured like dropped glass. Suleiman, ever the strategist, didn't annex the territory outright. Instead, he installed John Zapolia, a Hungarian noble willing to swear fealty, as his puppet king in Buda. This was Ottoman statecraft at its most cunning. By leaving a veneer of Hungarian sovereignty, Suleiman avoided provoking a unified Christian backlash while ensuring Ottoman dominance. But the Habsburgs, Hungary's western neighbors, saw an opportunity. Archduke Ferdinand, brother of Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, claimed the Hungarian throne through marriage ties, setting the stage for a three-way struggle. What followed was a diplomatic and military stalemate that lasted decades, a shadow war, where Ottoman-backed Zapolia and Habsburg-backed Ferdinand vied for control, while Suleiman played them against each other. The Ottomans systematically fortified their gains, transforming central Hungary into a forward base for raids deep into Austria, their cavalry striking as far as the gates of Vienna. The aftermath of Mohács reshaped Central Europe for generations. The once proud Kingdom of Hungary, now cleaved in two, became a battleground between two expanding empires. Ottoman-controlled Buda flourished as a multicultural hub, while Habsburg-held Pressburg, modern Bratislava, became Hungary's de facto capital in exile. The frontier between these spheres wasn't just a political border, it was a cultural fault line where coffee houses met wine taverns, where mosque minarets shared skylines with church spires. Yet for all its brutality, Mohács also revealed the limits of Ottoman power. Suleiman's decision to avoid outright annexation hinted at a strategic reality. Even the mightiest empire could overextend. The Habsburgs, though battered, wouldn't break, and in that uneasy balance between Ottoman ambition and Habsburg resilience, the fate of Central Europe would teeter for the next 150 years. The battlefield at Mohács, now a quiet field of wildflowers and memorial stones, stands as silent witness to a single afternoon that tilted the continent's destiny. The Janissaries began as an experiment in human engineering, an elite corps forged from the empire's most unlikely material. Founded in the 14th century under Murad I, their ranks were filled through the devshirme system, Christian boys taken as children, converted to Islam and drilled into the perfect warriors. What set them apart wasn't just their training, it was their complete severance from family, tribe, or loyalty beyond the Sultan himself. They were the ultimate blunt instrument, a standing army in an age of feudal levies, answering to no one but the throne. Early on, their discipline was legendary. Janissaries ate, slept, and marched as one, forbidden to marry or own property lest distractions soften their edge. Their signature white caps and long muskets became symbols of Ottoman might. Their battle cries the soundtrack to empire building from Belgrade to Baghdad. But absolute loyalty is a fragile thing. By the 16th century, cracks began to show. The first warning came in 1449 when Janissaries revolted over pay, a shocking act of defiance against Murad II. The Sultan crushed the uprising, but the precedent was set. This corps of slave soldiers had learned the power of collective bargaining. Over time, their privileges multiplied. Suleiman the Magnificent, needing their support for his ambitious campaigns, granted them the right to marry and engage in trade. What began as concessions soon became dependencies. Janissary barracks morphed into political hubs, their commanders amassing fortunes through corruption and monopolies. The very system designed to keep them dependent now made them indispensable. The tipping point came in 1622 when the teenage Sultan Osman II made a fatal miscalculation. Fresh from a disastrous war against Poland, he blamed the Janissaries' declining discipline and secretly plotted to replace them with a new army drawn from Anatolian peasants. Word leaked. What followed wasn't just a mutiny, it was regicide. Janissaries stormed Topkapi Palace, dragged Osman to the notorious Seven Towers prison, and strangled him with a bowstring. For the first time, the slave soldiers had killed their master, a seismic shift in Ottoman power dynamics. From then on, the Janissaries weren't just soldiers, they were kingmakers. Sultans rose and fell by their whim. In 1648, they deposed Ibrahim the Mad after he ordered the drowning of his entire harem. In 173, they overthrew Mustafa III for daring to reform their bloated ranks. Each revolt followed a pattern: demands for higher pay, rejection of modernization, and brutal punishment for any ruler who challenged their privileges. Their once vaunted discipline gave way to decadence barracks filled with illegal taverns, battle drills abandoned for guild monopolies on everything from coffee to candles. By the 19th century, the Janissaries were a grotesque parody of their former selves. Their numbers had swollen from 15,000 to over 130,000, many barely trained, all siphoning state coffers dry. When reform-minded Mehmed II finally moved against them in 1826, the showdown was inevitable. He'd spent years laying the groundwork, secretly training a modern artillery corps. On a summer night dubbed the Auspicious Incident, Ottoman cannons leveled Janissary barracks across Istanbul. Survivors were hunted down, their corps disbanded with a ruthlessness that mirrored its founding. The elite force that had once carried the empire to glory ended as a cautionary tale, proof that even the sharpest sword dulls when loyalty turns to leverage. Their legacy is a paradox. The Janissaries were both the empire's backbone and its cancer. For centuries, they exemplified Ottoman ingenuity, turning outsiders into fanatical defenders of the state. But their metamorphosis from disciplined slaves to entitled power brokers mirrors empires themselves, systems that rise on innovation only to fossilize under the weight of their own success. In the end, the Janissaries didn't just serve the Ottoman story, they became it. The Sunni-Shia divide in the Islamic world wasn't just theological, it was a fault line that shaped empires. Nowhere was this more explosive than in the Ottoman-Safavid rivalry, a centuries-long duel for souls and territory that redraw the map of the Middle East. At its heart stood two visionary rulers, the Ottoman Sultan Selim I, a Sunni zealot who saw himself as Islam's sword, and Shah Ismail of Persia, the charismatic founder of the Safavid dynasty, who declared Shiism his empire's state religion with almost missionary fervor. Their clash wasn't merely political, it was a war of cosmic identities fought with poetry as fiercely as with scimitars. The battleground extended far beyond the plains of Saldaran, where Selim's cannons shattered Ismail's cavalry in 1514. This was ideological warfare waged through architecture, trade, and even carpet designs. The Safavids painted their mosques in vibrant turquoise, a visual rebuke to Ottoman austerity, while Ottoman scribes penned decrees labeling Shias as heretics worse than Christians. Trade routes became arteries of influence, with the Ottomans choking off Persian silk exports to Europe, and the Safavids luring discontented Turkmen tribes across the porous Anatolian border. Each empire cultivated fifth columns within the other's territory, Safavid dervishes whispering revolutionary sermons in Ottoman coffee houses, Ottoman spies stirring revolt among Persia's Sunni minorities. Saldaran's aftermath revealed the rivalry's paradox. Though Selim's victory secured Ottoman dominance, it didn't crush the Safavid idea. Ismail, wounded and humiliated, retreated to his capital at Tabriz and did something unexpected. He doubled down on religious propaganda. Safavid artists produced lush manuscripts depicting Saldaran not as a defeat, but as a martyrdom prelude. Persian poets reframed Shia identity around resilience in loss, a narrative that still resonates in modern Iran's revolutionary ethos. Meanwhile, the Ottomans, despite winning the battlefield, found themselves trapped in a forever war. Selim's massacres of Shia communities in Anatolia, thousands slaughtered as Kizilbash traitors, only deepened the sectarian trench. Centuries later, the echoes of this rivalry still hum beneath the surface of Middle Eastern conflicts. The Ottoman-Safavid border crystallized into today's Turkey-Iran divide, with Ankara and Tehran still vying for influence from Baghdad to Beirut. Modern sectarian tensions in Iraq and Syria often trace their roots to the demographic scars left by 16th-century deportations and conversions. Even cultural preferences carry faint whispers of the old divide: Turkish coffee's dominance versus Persian tea culture, or the competing architectural legacies of Istanbul's domes and Isfahan's spiral minarets. What began as a dynastic squabble became a tectonic shift, proving that the most enduring conflicts aren't fought over land alone, but over the stories people tell about who they are. The Ottomans and Safavids didn't just share a frontier, they forged the identities that would outlast their empires, leaving a sectarian and cultural legacy that still shapes the Middle East's fractured soul. The autumn rains of 1529 turned the roads outside Vienna into rivers of mud, slowing Suleiman the Magnificent's advance to a crawl. His army, the largest ever assembled by the Ottomans, over 120,000 strong with camels, siege engines, and 300 cannons, had marched over 1,000 miles from Istanbul. But nature proved a merciless enemy. Wagons sank axle-deep in sludge, supply lines stretched to breaking point, and dysentery ravaged the ranks. By the time the Sultan's tents rose before Vienna's walls in late September, his troops were exhausted, their gunpowder damp, their momentum sapped. The Ottomans, masters of timing in every other campaign, had arrived too late. Vienna itself was a fortress transformed. Anticipating the siege, Habsburg commander Nicholas Graf Salm had spent months reinforcing medieval walls with modern earthworks, thick, sloping berms that absorbed cannon shots like sponges. The city's defenders, though outnumbered 10-1, held two critical advantages: the concentric rings of bastions designed by Italian engineers, and the iron discipline of German and Spanish mercenaries. Unlike previous Ottoman sieges, there would be no single weak point to exploit. Every assault met murderous crossfire from overlapping angles, while underground tunnels allowed defenders to shift troops unseen. Even Suleiman's famed Janissaries found themselves bogged down in brutal street-by-street fighting, their white caps easy targets for Habsburg marksmen perched on rooftops. Then came the rains, torrential, unrelenting. Ottoman trenches flooded, turning siege works into swamps. Camels, unused to the damp cold, sickened and died. Supply trains from distant Buda were ambushed by Croatian cavalry, leaving the army desperately short of food and dry gunpowder. Suleiman, facing the onset of winter and rumors of a relief force gathering in Bavaria, made the unthinkable decision on October 14th: retreat. His withdrawal wasn't disorderly. The Ottomans burned campsite and took thousands of captives, but the message reverberated across Europe. For the first time, the seemingly unstoppable Ottoman war machine had been halted not by a catastrophic defeat, but by the grinding realities of logistics and terrain. Historians still debate Vienna's significance. Some argue it exposed the limits of Ottoman power. Their supply lines couldn't sustain grand campaigns so far from home, and European fortifications had evolved beyond their siegecraft. Others counter that Suleiman's failure was temporary. He returned in 1532 to conquer much of Hungary, proving the empire's resilience. But perhaps the real legacy lies in the psychological shift. Vienna's survival shattered the myth of Ottoman invincibility, giving Christendom a template for resistance. Future defenders from Malta to Lepanto would study Salm's tactics: how earthworks neutralized cannons, how preparation trumped numbers. The siege also revealed a truth the Ottomans themselves would grapple with for centuries: that even the mightiest empires are bound by geography, climate, and the stubborn will of those who refuse to kneel. What might have happened if Suleiman had arrived just weeks earlier, before the rains? Would Vienna's fall have opened the road to Rome, as some chroniclers feared? We'll never know, but the 1529 siege stands as a hinge moment, not the end of Ottoman ambition in Europe, but the point where their advance met forces it couldn't simply overwhelm. The Sultan left Vienna's walls intact, but in failing to topple them, he inadvertently built something far more enduring: the idea that even the grandest imperial designs have their breaking point. Amidst the clash of empires and the thunder of conquests, the Ottoman Golden Age birthed a cultural renaissance that still takes the breath away. At its heart stood Mimar Sinan, a genius of stone and space whose mosques didn't just dominate skylines, they whispered to the soul. Take the Selim I Mosque in Edirne, his crowning achievement. Unlike Hagia Sophia's borrowed Byzantine grandeur, Sinan's masterpiece was pure Ottoman innovation. A central dome so vast it seemed to float, supported not by bulky pillars but by 8 slender arches that defied physics. The interior was a symphony of light, hundreds of windows filtering sunlight through stained glass to paint the marble floors in ever-shifting patterns. And the minarets, 3 slender needles piercing the heavens, each with 3 balconies symbolizing Sinan's rise from conscripted devshirme recruit to imperial architect. This wasn't just a place of worship, it was stone turned into philosophy, a declaration that Ottoman art had come of age. Yet architecture was only one thread in a tapestry of creativity. In the palace workshops of Topkapi, artisans perfected the art of the miniature tiny, jewel-like paintings that brought epic poetry and court chronicles to life. Unlike European frescoes obsessed with perspective, Ottoman miniatures reveled in symbolism. A sultan's portrait might show him smaller than his attendants, not because of artistic limitation, but to emphasize his humility before God. Scenes from Fuzeli's love poems or the adventures of Layla and Majnun burst with lapis blues and gold leaf, their flat planes drawing the eye to intricate details. A single tulip petal containing entire gardens, the delicate pattern on a coffee cup revealing the drinker's rank. These weren't mere illustrations, they were visual puzzles layered with Sufi mysticism and political allegory. Calligraphy, too, reached its zenith under the reed pens of masters like Sheikh Hamdullah. In a culture where the written word was sacred, scribes transformed Quranic verses into hypnotic swirls of ink. The sultans understood the power of the pen as keenly as the sword. Suleiman himself penned over 3,000 poems under the pseudonym Muhibbi, his verses comparing Istanbul's skyline to a bride adorned in minarets. Court calligraphers wielded their brushes like magicians, crafting imperial decrees where the thickness of a single stroke could convey the sultan's wrath or mercy. The most prized works weren't locked away but displayed in public fountains and mosque courtyards, turning entire cities into open-air galleries of divine wordplay. What set this golden age apart wasn't just the art itself, but the system that nurtured it. The Ottoman court didn't merely patronize artists, it institutionalized excellence. The Al-i Hayaf, or Community of the Talented, was a guild-like structure where painters, weavers, and jewelers received salaries, promotions, even tax exemptions based on merit. Armenian ceramicists from Anatolia collaborated with Persian textile designers and Arab mathematicians to create patterns so precise they anticipated fractal geometry. The famous Iznik tiles, with their coral red tulips and sapphire arabesques, became the empire's visual signature, adorning everything from mosque walls to Venetian collectors' cabinets. Underlying it all was a worldview that saw beauty as divine currency. When Sinan designed a mosque, he calculated acoustics so a whisper at the mihrab could reach the farthest corner, because clarity in prayer mattered as much as grandeur. When a miniaturist painted a rose, its petals contained 33 layers of wash, one for each year of Christ's life, a nod to the empire's Christian subjects. This was art as empire building, where every brushstroke and arch proclaimed a message. That Ottoman rule wasn't just about power, but about elevating the human spirit. The true masterpiece of the Golden Age wasn't any single building or manuscript. It was the proof that an empire could conquer not just with armies, but with sheer, soul-stirring beauty. Beneath the gilded domes of Topkapi Palace, behind walls draped in silk and secrecy, thrived an institution far more complex than the exotic fantasies of European painters, the Ottoman harem. Far from a mere pleasure quarters, this was a meticulously regulated political ecosystem where women didn't just share the sultan's bed, they shaped imperial policy. At its zenith during the 16th and 17th centuries, the harem became a shadow court, a place where alliances were brokered, fortunes made, and wars decided. The most legendary of these figures was Hurrem Sultan, known to Europeans as Roxolana, a woman who dismantled centuries of tradition to become the empire's most powerful consort. Hurrem's ascent was unprecedented. Born in what's now Ukraine, she was captured in a Crimean raid and sold into slavery, eventually entering Suleiman the Magnificent's harem. What set her apart wasn't just beauty, it was strategic genius. While earlier consorts bore sons and faded into obscurity, Hurrem broke protocol by demanding Suleiman's exclusive attention, even convincing him to formally marry her, a practice abandoned by sultans for generations. She corresponded with foreign monarchs, funded mosques and bathhouses, and whispered in the ear of a ruler who commanded 3 continents. When her rival, the Grand Vizier Ibrahim Pasha, opposed her influence, she orchestrated his downfall with chilling precision. By the time of her death in 1558, Hurrem had redefined the role of imperial women, proving that power in the Ottoman world could flow as easily from a palace apartment as from a battlefield. Her legacy birthed what historians call the Sultanate of Women, a period spanning the late 16th and 17th centuries where Valide sultans, mothers of ruling sultans, and favored consorts wielded unparalleled influence. Take Kursum Sultan, the de facto ruler during 2 reigns, first as mother to Murad IV, then as grandmother to Mehmed IV. When her son Ibrahim I descended into madness, it was Kursum who negotiated with Janissary commanders, brokered peace treaties, and even approved military campaigns. Her assassination in 1651, orchestrated by her own daughter-in-law Turhan Sultan, underscored the high stakes of harem politics, where power could be as lethal as it was intoxicating. The harem's structure mirrored the empire itself, hierarchical, fluid, and ruthlessly efficient. At its base were the odalisques, young women trained in languages, music, and courtly arts. The lucky few who caught the sultan's eye became iqbals, receiving their own apartments and stipends. Only one could rise to Hayski Sultan, the chief consort, while the Valide Sultan reigned supreme as matriarch. Eunuchs, often of African or Balkan origin, served as gatekeepers and spies, their loyalty rewarded with vast estates. Even the harem's architecture spoke to its role, a labyrinth of chambers and courtyards designed to control access and information where whispers could topple viziers. European observers, steeped in Orientalist fantasies, reduced this intricate world to tales of silk-clad concubines and despotic lust. But the harem's real currency wasn't carnal, it was knowledge. Women here mastered languages to intercept diplomatic correspondence, pooled wealth to fund charitable foundations that bought public loyalty, and forged alliances with provincial governors through strategic marriages. When the empire faced financial crisis in the 1600s, it was Turhan Sultan who intervened, negotiating tax reforms and stabilizing the currency. The harem didn't undermine the Ottoman state. In many ways, it saved it from the sclerosis of male-only governance, introducing flexibility and backchannel diplomacy at critical moments. Understanding the harem's political role flips the script on traditional narratives of Islamic empires. These women weren't exceptions to patriarchal rule, they were its architects, leveraging their unique position outside formal institutions to bend the empire's trajectory. Their stories reveal a truth often buried beneath exotic stereotypes, that the Ottoman Empire's longevity owed as much to the chess played in palace corridors as to the cannon fire on its frontiers. The harem wasn't a gilded cage, it was a throne room by other means. The lifeblood of the Ottoman Empire pulsed along the ancient arteries of the Silk Road, where camel caravans laden with spices, silks, and gemstones snaked through mountain passes and deserts straight into the heart of Istanbul. Controlling these routes wasn't just about wealth, it was about wielding a stranglehold over the global economy. At their peak, the Ottomans commandeered every major overland path linking Asia to Europe, from the bustling bazaars of Aleppo to the docks of Constantinople. Merchants passing through paid a staggering 30% in customs duties, filling the Sultan's coffers with Venetian ducats and Persian silver, but the real power lay in scarcity. By controlling access to luxuries like Chinese porcelain and Indian pepper, the Ottomans could dictate prices across continents, turning European markets into willing hostages to their monopoly. Yet the empire's mastery of terrestrial trade hid a fatal vulnerability: the sea. While Ottoman officials meticulously taxed every bolt of Persian silk that crossed their borders, Portuguese explorers like Vasco da Gama were charting a dangerous gamble: a direct sea route to India around Africa's Cape of Good Hope. When da Gama's ships returned to Lisbon in 1499 with hulls bursting with spices bought cheaply at the source, the shockwaves reached Istanbul. Suddenly, the painstakingly taxed caravans were undercut by cargoes unburdened by Ottoman tolls. Venice, once the Ottomans' greatest trading rival, watched in horror as its middleman profits evaporated, while Antwerp and Amsterdam emerged as new hubs for untaxed Eastern goods. The Ottomans weren't blind to the threat. Suleiman the Magnificent poured resources into expanding the navy, tasking Admiral Hereddin Barbarossa with turning the Red Sea and Persian Gulf into Ottoman lakes. They captured Aden in 1538, aiming to choke off Portuguese ships before they could reach India. But controlling thousands of miles of coastline proved far harder than guarding mountain passes. Smugglers and European pirates exploited the empire's vast maritime borders, while storms and shipworms ravaged Ottoman fleets built for Mediterranean calm, not open ocean voyages. By the late 16th century, the economics became undeniable. A single Portuguese carrack could carry as much spice as 1,000 camels without paying a single axe in Ottoman taxes. What sealed the Ottomans' fate wasn't just European seamanship but their own success. The very infrastructure that made land trade so profitable. The caravanserais, the toll stations, the armies protecting routes became a drag on innovation. Why risk uncertain sea ventures when overland taxes still flowed? This complacency had consequences. As European silver from New World mines flooded markets, inflation gutted the Ottoman economy. The price of Anatolian wheat quintupled between 1550 and 1650, while the empire's once precious Asian luxuries became commonplace in London and Lisbon. By the time Ottoman commanders fully grasped the scale of the shift, the Dutch and English had not only bypassed their routes, they'd built entire trading empires in the East Indies, leaving the sultans to collect dwindling tolls from a shrinking caravan trade. The lesson written in these currents was stark: control geography, and you control wealth, but only until someone redraws the map. The Ottomans had built an empire on the Old World's terms, mastering the physics of deserts and mountain passes. Yet the future belonged to those who could harness the wind and waves, turning oceans into highways rather than barriers. The Silk Road hadn't disappeared, it had simply been outflanked, leaving the empire straddling a crossroads that fewer and fewer travelers needed to cross. The morning of October 7, 1571, dawned on the Gulf of Patras with an eerie calm, the kind that precedes storms both meteorological and historical. Two colossal fleets faced each other: the Holy League's Christian Armada, a coalition of Spanish, Venetian, and Papal ships, and the Ottoman navy, still basking in its reputation as the Mediterranean's unbeatable force. What unfolded over the next 5 hours wasn't just a battle. It was the bloodiest naval engagement since antiquity, a clash that would later be mythologized as the moment the Ottoman tide finally crested. The Battle of Lepanto saw over 40,000 men perish, the Mediterranean's waters stained crimson, and the Ottomans lose all but 30 of their 250 ships. To European observers, it felt apocalyptic, a divine smiting of the terror of the world. Yet history, as it often does, refuses neat narratives. The immediate aftermath seemed catastrophic for the Ottomans. Their admiral, Muizzin Zaid Ali Pasha, lay decapitated on his flagship's deck. The Holy League had captured 130 Ottoman vessels, along with 12,000 Christian galley slaves who'd rode in chains beneath Ottoman whips. The psychological blow was seismic. For the first time in living memory, the Sultan's navy had been humbled. In Rome, Pope Pius V declared victory a miracle, commissioning paintings of the battle as proof of divine favor. Venetian pamphleteers spun tales of Ottoman invincibility shattered, while Spanish poets hailed Lepanto as the West's redemption after centuries of Islamic naval dominance. But here's where the story twists. The Ottomans, far from collapsing into disarray, responded with the cold efficiency of a wounded predator. Grand Vizier Sokollu Mehmed Pasha, the empire's true administrative genius, dismissed the defeat to the Venetian ambassador with chilling nonchalance. "You singed our beard, but we lopped off your arm." A beard grows back, an arm does not. His words weren't mere bravado. Within 6 months, the Ottomans had rebuilt their fleet, not just matching their pre-Lepanto numbers, but exceeding them in quality. By 1573, they'd seized Cyprus from the Venetians, the very conflict that had triggered Lepanto, proving their capacity to absorb losses and retaliate with devastating precision. What makes Lepanto so fascinating isn't the battle itself, but the paradox it reveals about imperial decline. Yes, the Ottomans lost ships and seasoned sailors they couldn't easily replace, especially the elite archers who'd trained for years to fire accurately from rolling decks. But their real vulnerability lay deeper. While the Holy League innovated, fielding heavily armed galleasses, floating fortresses that demolished Ottoman galleys, the Ottomans clung to boarding tactics better suited to 15th century warfare. Their reliance on slave rowers meant that, unlike Venetian oarsmen who fought when boarding parties approached, Ottoman rowers had no stake in victory. Most damningly, the battle exposed the limits of the empire's recruitment system, where devshirme-trained Janissaries excelled on land, but couldn't compensate for naval commanders promoted through nepotism rather than merit. Yet resilience defines empires as much as battles do. The Ottomans didn't just recover materially, they adapted strategically. Post-Lepanto, they shifted focus from Mediterranean galley duels to securing Yemeni coffee ports and challenging Portuguese dominance in the Indian Ocean. Their shipyards adopted broader beam designs to accommodate heavier guns, while coastal fortresses like Algiers became unsinkable aircraft carriers of corsair raids. By 1574, Ottoman fleets were raiding Crete and Apulia, forcing Venice to sign a humiliating peace that ceded Cyprus permanently. So was Lepanto a turning point or a speed bump? The answer depends on where you stand. For Christendom, it became a rallying myth, proof that the Ottomans weren't invincible. For the Sublime Porte, it was a costly lesson in naval evolution, one they partly heeded. The battle didn't trigger Ottoman decline, but it did foreshadow the creeping sclerosis that would plague the empire, an overconfidence in outdated methods, a bureaucracy resistant to reform, and the slow erosion of qualitative military edge. Like an aging lion still capable of lethal swipes, the Ottomans could rebound from Lepanto, but the world was changing, and their ability to change with it would decide their fate. From the rugged hills of Anatolia to the domed skyline of Constantinople, the Ottoman ascent reads like history's most improbable underdog story. What began as a scrappy band of frontier Ghazis warriors clinging to the edges of a crumbling Byzantine world exploded into an empire that reshaped continents. Their secret, there wasn't just one. The Ottomans mastered the art of turning weaknesses into advantages, blending brute force with bureaucratic brilliance, and rewriting the rules of conquest as they went. Take their military evolution. They didn't invent gunpowder, but they weaponized it with terrifying efficiency, turning cannons like the basilica into siege breakers that shattered thousand-year-old walls. Yet technology alone didn't secure their victories. It was their ability to adapt, learning from failed sieges, incorporating rival tactics, and fostering an officer corps where a Bosnian slave could rise to command armies. The Janissaries, for all their later corruption, were originally a stroke of grim genius, a standing army of outsiders whose loyalty was bought not with land but with purpose. But conquest means little without governance, and here the Ottomans outmaneuvered rivals with ruthless pragmatism. They didn't just crush opponents, they absorbed them. A Byzantine tax system became their revenue backbone. Christian nobles found seats in their divan. The millet system let subject peoples keep their faith so long as they paid tribute, a policy less about tolerance than efficiency. Why waste resources forced conversions when coexistence filled coffers? Even their architecture whispered this flexibility, with Sinan's mosques borrowing Byzantine engineering while adding minarets that pierced the sky like exclamation points. And then there's the question of sheer survival. The Ottomans didn't just rise, they endured, weathering catastrophes that would have doomed lesser dynasties. Timur's rampage left them fractured, yet they clawed back. Lepanto sank their fleet, yet they rebuilt it within a year. When sultans grew complacent, the empire's women like harem and kursum steered the state from the shadows of the harem. This wasn't just resilience, it was institutional improvisation on a grand scale. So what fueled their rise? Was it the thunder of cannons at Constantinople, the ink of Suleiman's legal codes, or the quiet diplomacy of a Venetian merchant sipping coffee in Istanbul's Grand Bazaar? Perhaps the answer lies in the question itself. Their genius was refusing to choose. They were warriors when needed, administrators when required, and chameleons when survival demanded it. In the end, the Ottomans didn't just build an empire, they authored a masterclass in how to thrive at the crossroads of continents, cultures, and eras. Now we turn to you. What do you think was the decisive ingredient in the Ottoman recipe for domination? Military might, political flexibility, or something more intangible, the ability to see the future not as a threat but as clay to be molded? Drop your theories in the comments and let's keep the debate alive. After all, the best histories aren't just told, they're discussed, dissected, and reinvented with every generation.